So today I'm going to talk about mental health promotion in Australian schools, and maybe we could have a conversation going about what some of the comparisons are. I'm going to introduce some policies and frameworks, talk about some of my own research projects, talk about what can be done in schools and evaluations of what has been done in schools, and I've also got some resources for schools as well. And you probably know some of this stuff, that 20% of the world's young people are considered or estimated to have a mental disorder or a mental problem at some stage in their life. It doesn't mean that they all have a mental disorder at the same time, but at some stage that's the estimation, that 20% of young people are affected. The key thing for schools, or the key thing for the field that I'm working in, is that half of all the people who develop a mental disorder have their first symptoms by the age of 14. And even that's somewhat misleading. It's not the case that the day you turn 14 something happens, but things start very early, and therefore early intervention is the key. Here's some charts. This is from a survey of mental health in Australia of adolescents starting at 16, but keeping in mind that these things don't start at your 16th birthday. And the three types of disorders that are measured here are anxiety disorders, getting up to 20% of the population in the 35 to 54 age group. The dotted line is substance use disorders, that's drugs and alcohol. And the dark blue line, affective disorders, largely covers things like depression. So that's a substantial proportion of the population going into adulthood. And from what I can read on sites like the World Health Organization and UNESCO, the statistics are similar in the UK. This is interesting because this is for very young children. So we're looking at children starting school. This is taking a census of children as they're about to start school. And their first year of full-time school in Australia, it varies, but they could be 4.5 to 5.5, thereabouts. Sometimes they're a smidgen younger, and there's a bit of a movement in Australia to withhold school starting. So some parents are not starting their kids till they're 6, but on the whole, 5's the indicator, or 4 to 5. And you can see that overall there's been a big sort of impetus for language and cognitive skills, and so the proportion of students who are showing difficulties in that area are decreasing. But my interest is in some of these other lines. The emotional maturity, which is hovering around 8 to 9% of children who are experiencing difficulties with age-appropriate emotional maturity. And the orange line, health and well-being, which is getting up from 9 to 10% of children who are having difficulties. So if we're talking early intervention, we need to be looking at this age group as well. They're continuing every 2 or 3 years with this census, is my understanding. It's a large project by the Australian Council of Education Research. So I imagine most of you are familiar with this, but when we talk about mental health, we don't just talk about the absence of mental illness, but we talk about full flourishing and functioning and living productively and fruitfully. So let's look at some of the policies and frameworks. We have all sorts of things, as I imagine you do. We had a roadmap, which was even earlier than this roadmap, but the current roadmap, is that a term you use here, a sort of a directional thing? Sort of, well, we have a roadmap, which is a guide unlike Google Maps, which I've been having a lot of trouble with in Manchester, I might say, for national mental health reform. And that's not just for the schooling sector, but that's across all sectors. That sets out the basic fundamental values and directions that Australia wants to be going in. And that's put together by representatives from all states and territories and the central government. We have an oldie but goodie, the Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young Australians. That narrows our policy framework down to education, and it sets out the sorts of things we want to see happen broadly in education in Australia. We have all sorts of associated educational frameworks, policies you could say. The National Safe Schools Framework, ensuring that schools are safe places to be, with bullying prevention programs as an example. We also have national anti-bullying policies. We have a wellbeing framework. We have, of course, a national Australia, maybe not, of course, that might not be the case in other countries, but we have a national Australian curriculum which doesn't tell teachers exactly what to do, but it tells them the sorts of things that we should be teaching and learning in Australia. And we have standards for teachers, and I'm going to give you a little taste of the sorts of things that are in those policy frameworks. So the Roadmap for National Mental Health Reform says things, it's a huge document, this is just little bits of it, says things like families, schools and communities need to help build resilience, to enable people to cope, to recognise and tackle the warning signs of mental illness, and to break down social stigma. So that's a broad statement of our values. We need to extend that throughout the whole community, such as workplaces and educational institutions, to provide support and flexibility for employees and students, including managing learning activities, and you can read the rest. So this is an agreed document between political parties of different persuasions. So each of our states might have a different political party, such as Labor in one state, Liberal in another state, and over all of that, at the federal level, you might have, at the next election, which is coming up very soon, who knows, we might have the Nick Xenophon team, or the Greens, or probably not, but you never know. But this is a joint statement. We have the Melbourne Declaration, and these are our goals for young Australians, that all children will be supported to develop a sense of self-worth, self-awareness, personal identity, emotional, mental, spiritual and physical well-being. And the things that we hear and try to foster in our intervention programs, such as optimism, developing knowledge, skills, understanding and value and confidence, healthy relationships, and the ability to make decisions. And those of you who are familiar with the CASEL framework will start to see some similar terminology showing here. We have a national curriculum, and it covers the core areas of schooling, but you see that within usually health and PE, or within that sort of area, you'll see this kind of wording coming out: safety, well-being, empathy, respectful relationships, challenging assumptions and challenging stereotypes. This is still at the broad values and policy level. This doesn't hand teachers a lesson plan and say this is the content you will teach. My particular interest is looking at that bridge between a policy framework and how that's enacted by a teacher in a classroom. We've got a few more steps to go. The national curriculum provides a mapping document which says that in these areas, such as foundation to year 2, years 3 to 6 and years 7 to 10, these are the areas of content focus. And you'll see that mental health and wellbeing actually does get its own line, and it happens in all 3 stages of schooling. So it's mapped out to that extent. Associated with that, sort of in a different line of thinking, but I thought you might be interested in the Australian standards for teachers. Teachers have to know and do certain things at each stage of their career, say straight out of university or within 3 to 5 years or as an advanced or proficient teacher. And wellbeing can be found even within the, promoting student wellbeing can be found within the Australian standards for teachers. And it comes into places like knowing students and how they learn, and that you're required to engage in professional learning. And as an example of that, I can show you some extracts. For example, a graduate teacher or a proficient teacher, a highly accomplished teacher or a lead teacher, and these are stages of promotion through the system. At graduate level, needs to be able to show that they support students' wellbeing. At proficient level, they need to ensure wellbeing, implement school or system curriculum and legislative requirements such as the National Safe School Framework. When you move on to highly accomplished, your responsibilities increase. Initiate, implement curriculum, and as leader. So that was one example. 4.4 and 7.3 is an important part as well, is what you are expected to do in terms of engaging with parents to support students' wellbeing. If you're interested in that document, which is a national document, I can send it to you, or you can just Google it. So that's sort of at the whole of Australia level, and then each state has its own policies and frameworks. So my state, for example, I'm from South Australia, and the Department of Education and Child Development has a learner wellbeing framework, which once again looks a lot like the various frameworks that you can see. I can't see mine, the print is so small, but you can see that learners are at the centre of that, and it goes in a kind of Bronfenbrenner kind of onion or spiral. And the 5 little slices of pie that go around the learner are similar to the CASEL, although there is a spiritual in there as well. Not CASEL, sorry. Spiritual, social, cognitive, can't read that one, emotional and physical. Our school system is secular, so the inclusion of spiritual was highly contested and continues to be contested. In addition to our secular states schools, we also have Catholic schools, independent schools and various other schools of particular religious denominations.
How big are those sectors? Is the private sector 30%?
I don't know. That sounds about right.
And the religious sector?
I don't know. I can look that up.
Sorry? 7.
Yeah.
Private.
Mark told me that yours was 30% and he goes to Australia a lot, so I imagine 30%.
Could be, but that depends whether he's talking about... We have an independent private sector, which is probably equivalent to your schools where you pay a lot of money to go. Well, you would call that a public school?
Although they're not.
Although they're not public.
Public and private.
So we have the state school that is funded by taxes. We have the independent sector of fairly high cost to the parents to go, which is also funded by the taxpayer, but the parents pay as well. But then there's also a sector of Catholic schools and other small religious schools which you pay to go to, but you don't pay as much. So that 30% could include all of those low cost plus high cost schools, or no, I think it would have to include all of those, and that would leave about 70% state school, but I actually don't know. There's a counter on here. It's suddenly appeared a clock.
Oh, ignore that.
Ignore that? Good. So that's the policy background. I'm going to tell you about some of the research that we've been doing about supporting students' mental health. And some of this comes from needing to make the argument that this is a worthwhile activity. I don't know what it's like here, but it is the case that not all school principals and not all teachers believe still that it's schools' responsibility to actively promote students' positive mental health. Of course, it's their belief that they should support students, but not to the degree perhaps implied by a mental health promotion program in a school or a wellbeing promotion program in a school. At the primary school level, I think that argument has pretty much faded out, and I haven't tested it, but I get the feeling in primary schools that teachers believe that it is their job to support students' positive mental health. At secondary school, the subject matter teachers, some will still say they're there to teach the subject matter, and it's not for them to be engaged in explicitly teaching to promote mental health, even though they would do that as part of their implicit practice. So some of this research is to make that argument that this is every teacher's job. So this is a simple, unpublished study, and it's 1,321 students who we gave the SDQ to, which is the lovely Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which is used throughout the world. It has a 3-point rating scale, which means it's not very parametric, but we use it anyway. What this says is that we've plotted student scores on the SDQ on the x-axis, and at the same time we gave them a large questionnaire about their learning strategies, and we've plotted that on the y-axis. And with that data set, I've analysed it in a number of ways, and this is the first simple analysis. And this says if you were in the normal group, that is, you were rated as normal on your mental health difficulties, because even though the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire is called Strengths and Difficulties, the score that you get is about your difficulties. If you effectively are normal and do not have untoward mental health difficulties, this simple bar chart, it's not a bar chart, sorry, this simple chart of medians and spread, box plot, says that you scored higher on the learning strategies that you choose to use in class, compared to if you have borderline mental health difficulties and compared to if you have abnormal mental health difficulties. Now, the reason this is interesting is that this is not a measure of your grade in a topic. That is, it's not how well did you do in biology or how well did you do in maths. This is when you apply learning strategies to your everyday learning, you can be differentiated according to your mental health status. And I'll talk that through a little bit more as to why I think that might be the case with some of the other charts that I've got here. But keep that in mind. It's a small effect size, but over large numbers of students each year of school, cumulative from R to 12 or 13, or foundation to 13, I think that adds up in terms of your ability to be an effective learner. This next one. This is a correspondence analysis, and it's not as complicated as it looks. Here the x-axis, instead of going across the bottom of the page, just goes across the middle of the page. And similarly, the y-axis, instead of going up the side, goes up the middle. And the reason it does that is because where it crosses at that little slightly to the right centre point is the zero. It's not really the 0 point, but it's effectively the 0 point. What we can see here, except that I can't see it. Can I get rid of all this stuff at the bottom? Ah, yes, I can. That's better. what we can see here is that when students answered questions about lots of things, like the learning strategies that you saw in the previous slide, but also about the SDQ, and also about how safe do you feel at school, how often have you been bullied, when teachers see bullying, how often do they do something about it, how well do you cope with schoolwork, what else? Oh, how many friends do you have? What is the impact of bullying on you? So when we asked a large battery of questions and put all of those scales into the one analysis, into correspondence analysis, we ended up, for your information, Michael, we ended up with a contingency table where we had all the variables across the top and all the variables down the side, and how many times each variable went with each variable for each case. It's a beautiful epidemiological tool, not used in Australia. Is it used in England much? It's used a lot in France and places like that. And the person who used this technique, who you would know, is Bourdieu, who looked at the social determinants of taste or aesthetics, and that's how he did it. He put all the variables across the top and all of them up the side, and he worked out that, you know, some classes of people really like chimney pots and stuff like that.
What went on? I mean, did he have a car accident or something?
Yeah, you didn't know that, did you?
No.
Yeah. So this is considered to be a qualitative quantitative technique because it sort of is multi-dimensional in the way it puts everything together. It's fantastic. What this one shows us, if you look along the x-axis, is this showing? Yes, it is. This shows our x-axis along here, and it shows that students who said, like you at school, is an emoticons series of faces, very sad to very happy. If you had a low score on that, that is, you're very sad. You cluster with students who have abnormal conduct problems. You cluster with not coping very well with schoolwork. You cluster with the low learning strategies that we saw on the previous page. You cluster with having abnormal emotional symptoms. You've got low motivation also showing on the left-hand side of the x-axis. None or very few, one, friends. Low strategies for coping with bullying. So if you were to build up a profile of the students who were responding low, low, abnormal, low, low, you'd see that they're responding to all of these scales in a similar way. And what you can do is then take these students out of the analysis and draw just a simple line profile of their scores, and they end up down here. In contrast, if you look over here, the students who feel safe at school, who have not been bullied, who don't necessarily have peer problems, who think that their teachers intervene when they see bullying, when they're happy, the like you scale is happy, etc., they cluster to the right-hand side. The argument that we're making with this analysis is that schools are such complex places that we can't look at one or two things in isolation. We can see from the profiles that this sort of analysis create that students are affected by all sorts of things going on in the environment. So any intervention needs to be multifaceted, needs to consider certainly the things that we've included here, but probably many other things as well. The next study does a bit more of that profiling. This is a different technique, it's not correspondence analysis. This is with our Maltese friends.
Oh, Carmel.
Pardon? Carmel. Yeah. So we collected this. Carmel organised for the questionnaire, the same questionnaire as the previous slide, but to be delivered in Maltese schools instead of Australian schools. but I analysed the data in a different way here. I actually drew the profiles and I selected, there was far too much data to do all of them, so this time instead of dividing students by their SDQ scores, I divided them according to whether they told us they were not involved in bullying at all, a victim of bullying, a bully, and they do tell us, which is a bit surprising, or a bully, both a bully and a victim. So once they were divided according to their involvement in bullying, we looked at some of those same indicators. And I won't talk about all of it, but just let's look at the purple line. The purple line is the students who are both bullies and victims, and they're only recently coming into the literature in the last few years. The category of student who is involved in both bullying and being a victim is turning up to be quite a source of concern. Here they are. This is the emoticons scale, very low, scoring very low on like you at school. They think that this is a question about whether you have a series of questions about how positive is the school community, a scale about positive school community. These students are saying that their school community is not positive. They're not feeling as though this is a nice place to be. We know about their learning strategies. We see that their reported learning strategies are low, and they're telling us they're not coping with schoolwork. We can see that this low profile is carrying through at the less desirable end of all of the scales we measured, like how safe do they feel at school? They're not feeling safe. Do they think that teachers intervene when they see bullying? No, they don't. Let's look over here. This is not the SDQ. This is an alternative measure of mental health with a nice 7-point Likert scale response option instead of just 3, and a larger range of questions. On these mental health measures, the positive mental health of the bully victims is exceedingly low, and the mental health problems scale is relatively high to the other students, as you would predict, as we would predict. But this evidence, when taken out to school teachers, is really powerful. Especially this chart seems to really strike a chord when we see what's the relative difference between these students, especially the ones who are bullies and victims. These differences between the students are all statistically and practically significant. Any questions? Well, moving right along. The page after this is really complicated. Do not worry, I'm going to just use it as a simple illustration. On the next page, once again, you're going to see the SDQ on the x-axis, but all of the questions in case you wanted to look at some of them, and the learning strategies questions on the y-axis, and all of them, which is why the next page is just too dense. But what I've done is a simple correlation between every question on the SDQ and every question in our learning strategy scale. And I've done that in order to try to understand what are the things that are causing the positive correlation between your score on a mental health difficulty scale and your score on a learning strategy scale. So don't worry. This is the next page. Now, you've got two scales here, both developed independently from each other. Robert Goodman's got his strengths and difficulties scale developed over there, and we've got our learning strategy scale developed over here. And all I've done is put them together. And then when I did that, I saw something which showed me, for example, in the learning strategy scale, we've got a question that asks students, do you discuss what you are doing in class with other students? And in the SDQ, there's a question that says, I usually share with others, for example, CDs, games and food. And there's a significant correlation between those two individual items. Let's think about that in the context of a class situation. So all the kids have gone out to lunch, they've gone to the playground, they've played, and they've had a fight at lunchtime. They didn't share their lollies. They come back into class and the teacher says, we're going to do group work this afternoon. And Michael, I want you to work with Neil.
Not there.
He doesn't share, yeah.
That's right. And you have to discuss your answer and come and tell me your joint decision in 30 minutes' time. You've got a teaching strategy that requires you to do cooperative, collaborative, discussion-based learning, and you've got students who perhaps lack the social skills to be able to do that. When you look at it from that point of view, things look interesting. In our learning strategy scale, we've got a simple question, I pay attention. Robert Goodman, in his hyperactivity scale, has got a question saying, I'm easily distracted, I find it difficult to concentrate. Are we talking here about a mental health difficulty, a learning strategy, or is this something that contributes to both things, which is a part of that student's personality?
Exploratory factor analysis of all the items.
Mm.
Did you do that? Did you do that? Come up with anything?
We can, if we fiddle around a bit,
Can you create a new?
I can create, well, to begin with, let's start with Robert Goodman's
Yeah.
SDQ. Depends if I put the all 20 or all 25 items into the EFA or as a CFA, but with a little bit of flexibility I can more or less replicate
Okay, yeah, that would be, yeah.
the SDQ subscales, and I do think the subscales are more worth looking at than the total score, but doing subscales here would have been a nightmare, and I think Jessica and you have spoken about the subscales being more indicative than the total score. With the learning strategy scale, that factors beautifully as one.
Well, if you put all the items in together, if it becomes harder to produce the original or pre-existing subscales, it would tell you that there was something else that was shared. So if it becomes harder to find the instrument, if you put all the items in together, you can't find the old subscales. It'll start to tell you that there is a new one.
Yeah, that's two completely different things, isn't it? Well, one's a mental health difficulty scale and one's a learning strategy scale. They are correlated. What I'm getting at there is that the things that we use, it's a bit like the old argument about, is there a G factor? Is there a G? I think that's what I'm saying. Is there a general, and that does relate. Okay, so yes, maybe I should put them all into an exploratory factor analysis and say, is there something happening underneath here? Anyway, I think that's interesting because if we're talking about mental health promotion in schools at the same time that we're doing teaching and learning, using the strategies that require well-developed social skills, emotional control, self-regulation of learning, self-regulation of emotion, do the capacities that we need to teach students for, say, self-regulation, apply to self-regulation for promoting mental health as well as self-regulation for promoting learning. And my initial hypothesis is, yes, I think we're teaching the same skills. That being the case, that's a really powerful argument to take to teachers to say, well, if you don't want to teach to promote mental health, what about teaching to promote the social and emotional regulation that you need in order to engage in the modern day classroom? I think that's reasonably powerful. And there's lots more in there if you go hunting for them. I'll leave that to you and move on. Just a note on some subgroups. Here's students divided by their bullying involvement, just straight against the SDQ. And you can see that here is our bully victims group again, almost 26%, not 26%, scoring Yes, 26%, sorry. Here they are by subscales, which is possibly more interesting. Bully victims, victims on emotional symptoms. Here's conduct problems, as you would expect. Bully victims, bullies. Hyperactivity, the bully victims again, and the bullies. And the peer problems. Now here's an extension of that analysis with the same group. Here we're looking at whether there's a mediating influence of friendships. If one of the things that you do for promoting positive mental health is develop students' social skills and their abilities to create friends, what we're saying with this analysis is that friendships seem to provide a protective buffer against mental health difficulties. Let me see if I can explain this. This is SDQ score on the y-axis, and this is how many friends do you have. If you're below the line, you're within the normal range of SDQ. Now, if you're a bully and you've got no friends, you're up here in the abnormal range of the SDQ. No, sorry, bully victim again. This is the bully victim line. If you've got one good friend at school, you're coming down into the borderline range. But if you've got good friends at school, it looks as though you can drop into the normal range of the difficulty score on the strengths and difficulties scale. If you're a victim, there's a similar pattern, that once you get some friends at school, there seems to be something protective happening. Let's have a look here at the bullies. The bullies don't say, on the whole, that they don't have any friends. And we have to think then about what does that mean in terms of what does a bully conceive of what a friend is. Is it a lot of people being around, or is it actually someone who is their friend? So we're not sure what to make of this little bit of bullies have always got 2 or 3 or many good friends in our data.
Are they asked to define friendship? I mean, that's quite an interesting thing. What is a friend? Might a bully perhaps think it's somebody that doesn't stop with bullying, or maybe perceptions are completely different because a bully thinks that he has friends because nobody dares stand up to him. I don't know. I just think it's very interesting.
That's what we think, yeah. So what is a good friend?
Yeah, somebody that doesn't challenge me.
Yeah, someone who doesn't bully me.
Yeah.
It's also making me think of, I forget who did it, but there was a piece of research done, I think here in the UK, years ago, when I was doing my psychology research, like 20 years ago, but it was challenging the widely held view that children who were bullies lacked social skills, because that was the perception, that they were just mindless thugs who were beating up other kids. And there were a couple of studies done that showed actually lots of bullies are actually quite socially intelligent.
Yeah.
And
Cognitively, socially intelligent.
And they're able to manipulate other people, and they're able to change the power structures in relationships with other people as part of the bullying. So it might be.
It's that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also this link to self-esteem. So if you think about a defensive high self-esteem, which is associated with narcissism, you're more likely to get bullies in there as well. So if they're completing a questionnaire or saying how many friends they've got, they believe that they've got more friends because of their falsely inflated high self-esteem.
Which means that's why the SDQ scores drop as well. Because you have defensive responses to some of the weakness, the deficit-based consciousness.
That's really interesting.
You could pull the subscales in the SDQ then, because you could test that by putting only the internalized symptoms.
Yeah.
So peer problems are in that could potentially conflate the peer problems subscale in there.
It's the peer problem subscale that doesn't seem to work all that well, but yes, I do think the subscale analysis is worth doing. And I think I've done some of it. It's just there are too many of these slides. There are more. I'll keep going. Here's a bit of analysis of students with special needs. This is a bit difficult to explain because it's sort of counterintuitive, but what this says is that the darker coloured bar are the students who claimed or self-reported special needs of any kind in the school, and we gave them a whole list of special needs, and they said whether they felt they had those or any other special need. And the lighter coloured bar are students who did not self-report having any special needs. And if you go across here, they filled out a Likert scale experience of well-being kind of scale, number of questions, and you can see that the students who reported having special needs reported, get this round the right way, that they experienced well-being about once a week or 2 or 3 times a week, more so than the students who did not report having special needs. However, the students who did not report having special needs were more likely to report that they experienced well-being almost every day or every day. So there's another division there of students who are very under-researched with respect to well-being and positive mental health, and that is students with special needs. And this was just a very broad snapshot of their self-reports of their daily well-being. So, this, having convinced the teachers and the schools and the principals and the department with all of that data about how important well-being is for and how we need to promote well-being in schools, we now make the case that schools are important sites for intervention. And this stuff I think you would all know, so I might go fairly quickly. You know from the people that you read and I read that schools are very useful sites for intervention. They contain all the kids, most of the kids, most of the time. They're staffed by teachers who understand children and who want to work with children and have the skills and knowledge to work with children. And we also know that this is an international endeavour, and I've been making a list of the various programs that are happening in various countries, and if you want to add anything to my list you can send me emails, and various people have been sending me emails about the things that are happening in their country. And the idea is prevention and promotion and students' full development. Aligned with that is this little piece of research where we ask the teachers, how confident and knowledgeable do you feel for supporting students' mental health? Now here we did an intervention in between, and so we've got time 1 and time 4, and whether or not our intervention, or not our intervention, where are the evaluators, whether or not the intervention made any difference. But it is interesting that some of these percentages are not that high. They're not dreadful, but they're not great. So here, for example, let's look at number 3. I know how to help students to develop skills to manage their own emotional, social or behavioural difficulties. That's 50% of teachers strongly agreed or strongly agreed with that. Which means 50% didn't, which is a bit of a worry. And after the intervention that did go up, but we're still not looking at, you know, the large majority of teachers. Here's another one. I know how to help students to develop skills to establish healthy relationships with other children. I know how to help students, or my teaching programs help students to develop an awareness of their own feelings. The lowest one, as we might expect, is down here. I can provide effective support for parents and caregivers about students' emotional, social and behavioural difficulties. Is that my job, to work with parents? Do I need to give them support? I can identify early signs of emotional, social or behavioural difficulties in students. So here we're looking at interventions not only for the students to develop their social and emotional skills, but also to develop the teachers' feelings of knowledge and self-efficacy and capability.
Is that primary school? Primary school.
This is students aged 10 and 11. So that's our primary school,
Yeah.
and our second last year and your last year. But by the time they'd done the intervention, they'd got a bit older. They became 10, 11, 12. This little chart is something that I use with teachers to say don't panic, because what this says is you might be talking at the broad level about mental health promotion. However, there are levels of intervention. There's a universal level of intervention, targeted intervention and indicative intervention. We know that, but that's a new concept for teachers in schools because this comes from a medical model. And universal intervention is what teachers do every day. They work with kids in classes about all sorts of things: anti-smoking, anti-bullying, anti-drugs, eating the food pyramid, all of it. Universal intervention programs all the time. Teachers have the knowledge and skills to deal with population level interventions. Targeted intervention, you might do some of that with a group in your school, or you might get some help in. You might get the school counsellor in, or you might get the local paths people in, or whatever, to do some targeted intervention. And indicative or indicated intervention, which is where you make a referral to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or someone else. And once teachers understand that they're working at the universal and possibly targeted level, and that there are other well-trained professionals working at the indicated level, it takes that idea of I have to do mental health promotion out of the realm of the impossible into something that I can do every day with my normal teaching. I use this chart with my Masters of Wellbeing students, and it gives them great relief. It's a good tablet. Here are some of the things that we've been doing in Australian schools. You perhaps have heard about Kids Matter, which is primary school mental health promotion, Kids Matter Early Childhood, which is in the long daycare centres and preschool centres, Mind Matters in secondary, Sensibility, which is a similar kind of thing, Responsibility, which is a whole program for pre-service teacher education. I use some of that myself, and the Masters in Education. So we've now got, not throughout the whole of Australia, but in little pockets around the place, interventions at from 0 to postgraduate study. This is some of the Kids Matter logo stuff that shows that it's a developmental intervention. And this shows the 4 components of intervention. Kids Matter is a framework, and I'm getting the sense that it's not the same as some of the things that I've been reading about that are happening here. Kids Matter is very much saying, around this framework of 4 components of intervention, let's see what will work in your school, what are you already doing, what programs would be useful for you to introduce to create a sense of community, develop SEL, work with parents and carers, and improve referrals, develop your relationships with psychologists, etc. And this is at all 3 levels of schooling.
The closest we have to that is, in terms of the framework, is Head Start, which is one of our new projects that we're doing research on at the moment, where it's lots of different interventions within a broader framework.
Right. So what Kids Matter provides, I'll show you some of what Kids Matter provides too. So you see how they provide the framework and they set up ways of you becoming engaged with those activities, but they don't provide tomorrow's lesson plan. First of all, I'll tell you about some evaluation of whether Kids Matter trials have worked or not. So this is our friend, the SDQ. This is the teachers filling out the SDQ on the kids in their class. This is 5,000 children. And this is the parents filling out the SDQ on those same 5,000 children. And they were matched with ID codes. So this is the same cohort. As you would expect, if you're already normal, you can't get any more normal, pretty much. So the normal kids, their mental health over 4 assessment periods didn't change. Looks like it goes down, but that's not significant. If they were in the borderline range, their mental health strengths went up. And if they were in the abnormal range, their mental health strengths went up even more. And I've made a mistake. The next one is the SDQ. Let me look. I'd have to peek at the next page. Yes, sorry, the next frame is the SDQ. This one is a measure of mental health strengths. So that was fairly impressive. That was done with hierarchical linear modelling, stratified by school, not state, because there weren't enough states to get a 3rd level. It's 3-level hierarchical linear modelling, stratified by school, and at level 1 it was within student over time. Here's the SDQ. These are the difficulties. Once again, if you're normal, not much changes. Once again, it's parent and teacher report on those 5,000 kids. If you're in the borderline range, your mental health difficulties went down. And see here that they're coming down from the borderline range into the normal range here, and the abnormal range. That's really powerful. We took that to government, and that evaluation led to nice amounts of extra money for Kids Matter to continue to be rolled out in schools.
So it's government sponsored, isn't it?
It's government sponsored. It's run through an NGO, Beyond Blue, and Beyond Blue also puts money in, and Rotary puts money in, but it's the Department of Health that is the foundational sponsor throughout Australia.
Department of Health, is that different? Do you have a Department of Education?
Yes.
There's health putting money in?
Yes. And we have a Federal Department of Education and Training. Can't remember its current name. It's changed a few times, but it's essentially, might be Science, Education and Training now, something. We have a State Department of Education. This is the Federal Department of Health. As part of the mental health roadmap.
That's your impact case study if you go the way that we've gone with research excellence. But you were talking about the other day.
One of our impacts. Yeah, that's the impact study that we do refer to, that impacted upon government decision to continue to roll out Kids Matter. This is Kids Matter Early Childhood. We did the same thing. We evaluated the rollout of a trial in 100 long day care and early childhood centres, and this is the SDQ score for 3 to 5 year olds, which was a bit tricky in terms of some of the questions that were asked, but you can only do what you can do. But once again, if you're normal, you're normal. Remember, this is only a 3-category scale. Borderline went down, abnormal went down, and I've put the effect sizes in here, medium and large effect sizes from the staff's responses, and small and large effect sizes from parents' responses.
Because you've rolled out a national framework which had differing levels of, is it difficult to attribute the framework, but there's variation within the framework?
Absolutely. So you can't say...
Could indicative to target the SDQ normal group or whatever?
They might be. Schools might be one school might be choosing to roll out bounce back. Another school might be choosing to roll out play is the way.
The fact that it's got noticeable effect sizes with that degree of variation on the framework, I think is very interesting.
It was highly resourced with project
So
officers. They had a dedicated project officer with every state who went out to the schools, did staff training, all sorts of things. It is no longer that highly resourced.
And is that being evaluated there? No, it's like
My interest is in sustainability of these things, and this is a very good case study.
So the people facilitating the implementation of actual intervention in school, are they trained around evidence-based interventions? Because somebody is recommending a consistent package of interventions that are making effect, aren't they? To get an effect size at a...
So it's programs. There are a limited number of programs that they can choose from, or who informs the decision on which programs are selected.
Yeah.
The school chooses which programs are selected.
Anything.
They could choose anything, and some of them did. One of the nice things that Kids Matter produced from the... sorry, do I have to stop? Is it stopping time? No? One of the really nice things that So Kids Matter was designed by a consortium of people, but a major player was the Australian Psychological Society. They reviewed a whole heap of stuff that's out there and gave it a rating, gave each program ratings on a number of things like did it attend to cognitive matters, did it attend to social and emotional, was it mostly this, was it mostly that, and it was a sort of a pie system rating, and the schools could look at the programs guide and say, well, we want something that will do X and Y. Which of these programs that have been pre-rated by the APS best suits our need? That was a very useful tool. It's still on the website that anyone can look at.
It's a little bit like Cassell Select or the EIF, Early Intervention Foundation's web tool.
But with a bit more of a focus around, it's a bit less just sweetie shop.
Just
pick one that works.
Yeah.
They were quite, I was quite amazed. They were quite willing to say if something didn't have something in it, it didn't get a rating.
Noticeable effect size for a nationwide framework of that size is interesting because it implies consistency. With a high
It's consistency framework. I'll show you an example of the sorts of things that were consistent.
Yeah.
The other things that we measured with the very young children, because we were worried about using the SDQ, so just quickly, is temperament, and that was the short temperament scale for toddlers and children by Pryor and colleagues. And you can see that measuring temperament over 4 measuring periods, that approach went up a little bit, not much. Inflexibility went down, and once again they're small effect sizes, significant but small effects. Sorry, I haven't finished yet. They'll all just, everyone can just leave.
No, I'm sure I'm the only one that's going to. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. So temperament, there seemed to be an effect on approach and inflexibility, or the flexibility if you like to think of it the other way. And the other interesting thing was staff-child relationships, which is that Pianta, I think? I'm trying to think whose scale that was. Let me see if I've written it down. I can't remember whose scale that was. I think Pianta, but I'd have to check. Yeah, Pianta, there it is. Once again, not much happening here, but something happening here with improving staff-child relationships. And just finally, on to some of the stuff. A big thing that Kids Matter did was to get schools to engage with what they're doing and what they're thinking, and they did that with all sorts of surveys. So they started the conversation around all of these issues and encouraged teachers to get together and talk about what was happening in their school, and they supported those activities with things like some basic background information, and then surveys. And in the beginning, these surveys, which were just for in-school use with their own staff or for the principal to look at, they were done on paper, but now this is all done on the web and all automatically collated for schools, and it's all put into a central database. It's all really nice, and you can track your school's progress if you do more than one.
Baseline for...
Do they complete them?
I do.
Because this is the thing with SEAL, they were supposed to start off by doing this sort of thing. Yeah, doing an audit, and they just didn't.
Intervention effects by starting position.
Yeah, so this was some of the first stuff you did. You did this auditing, your school audit, in various ways. And now, as I say, that's done on the web and the data is collated. Oh, I just shut the whole thing. Hang on. It's talking and not paying attention.
But that's really interesting that they can select a program, so they can start to look to see, okay, this is our need, we've got this perceived need, and this program will meet this need, and this need, and this need, and you've immediately got this buy-in, and you're improving.
But you could measure.
Yeah,
It was very good for
for.
buy-in because I did some of them, and I go back to the school and say, no, this is your school's data. It's not this esoteric stuff that I've done elsewhere. This is just your school, and this is what you said. So there's the school checkup. Hang on. Another key thing in the schools were the action teams. So you need drivers in the school, as you know, and people would volunteer to be the drivers, and they would make sure that these things were timetabled onto staff meetings and things. And these are the steps, the action plan. It wasn't what you had to do, but it was how you had to do it. So we've done getting started, we've done a PD, we've created our action plan. And similarly for component 2, we've implemented our action plan. In a process model, you would know that there are extra steps in that process model that you have to evaluate your action plan, review, make changes, try again. Some of those later stages of the process model weren't always carried all the way through, but sometimes they were. And you read our paper which talked about an implementation index, and we found with our implementation index that those who went through all the steps, all the way through to reviewing and revising, had a higher implementation scores on the implementation index. So that's where all of that stuff comes from.
The motivation to do that is also the motivation for buying that.
But you can try. Just so you know.
I don't know how to go back to the... It seems to go away when you open something. So there was a lot of provision of that sort of framework kind of resource. The other thing, lots of videos which are now all online, freely available, and you can create your own program around it. So I have all of these loaded up. I'll just see if any of them work. So this is one component of all the components. You might like to look at an Australian school. This is typical.
She's my teacher that I currently have now, and she helps me a lot when I'm having certain troubles with friends, or I don't really feel like I'm fitting in.
Well, I kind of like Mr. B because he can have a joke and he's got a good sense of humour.
I think it's very important for my kids to have a rapport with their teacher. If they don't have that rapport with the teacher, they're not going to learn as well.
It's important that we not underestimate the relationships that children form with teachers. The fundamental ingredient to that relationship is trust and respect on both sides. And learning about that is something that children do at school. Where that occurs, we see the ability of teachers to foster self-esteem,
You notice
motivation,
it's sunny.
interest, and exploration.
Just thought
in
I'd
children.
say.
Three key things for a supportive relationship between a teacher and the students, in my view, is that you really need to know kids well, you need to be fair, and you really need to believe them. If you do those three things, that will build a really powerful relationship.
So that goes on. And that's just an example of the sort of thing that a school might do in staff development as a kind of knowledge building activity. And for some reason, whenever I open something, the PowerPoint...
I think it's at the bottom on the block.
Oh, it's down there, is it?
Is it the press the P?
You think it's there? Oh, what a strange system.
Because my complaint is
And then there are other things like this one, for example, which deals with another component. And you can't just do any one of these kinds of things, but there are resources to support schools to think about all of them. Like, so this is working together to plan your scope and sequence.
Kids Matters approach to mental health promotion, you will embed an explicit social and emotional learning curriculum into your timetable at every level. And that will be a specific time when you overtly focus on developing those core skills which are fundamental to mental health.
If SAL is just left as an ad hoc things, then kids won't take it seriously. They won't see it as a serious part of the curriculum. It really does need to be timetabled in. If it's timetabled in and it's reported on, like most other things in the curriculum, then teachers will actually plan.
And if you're interested in these, they're all freely available on the web. And from that sort of thing that you might use with your teachers, you would then work together to choose the programs that, to program it in the timetable, and then the actual stuff that you use in the classroom. What I've been thinking, and in that paper that you and I are writing, is that what they talk about is the stuff that's being delivered in the classroom. The fidelity and all of that sort of stuff is how many times a week you do it, and how you deliver the lesson, but mainly it's what the lesson is about. But I think that this is looking at what's behind all of that, and that's where our investigations should be.
We've got these different levels of fidelity, and fidelity to this framework. The flexibility in selecting your own programme that satisfies the needs of your context, I think is a huge, huge thing. And then it would be interesting to see how much one of those interventions is adapted. If somebody feels that they've had a choice in selecting one and it's going to achieve these outcomes, I wonder if they have more fidelity to it then. It all goes back to this perception of need. It's not just benefits, it's the need. But I think I like this. I think it's really, really interesting. I'd be very interested to see the sustainability of this.
So am I.
Particularly if there's not facilitators or people there helping, because it puts me in mind of it's not called Bernard Brookness, what's it called? That's Sir Bernard, brokerage thing.
Yeah, the evidence brokerage service, yeah.
There are still resources and there are still facilitators. They're just not as strong on the ground as it was in the trial period. It's that same thing of once you get past your first 100 schools, how do you roll it out to 2,500 schools? And the number 2,500 just came to me. I think that's where they're at the moment, that Kids Matter is being rolled out in some form in 2,500 schools. Maybe more by now.
You've got the opinion leaders there as well.
All right, so we know what the issues are. Upscaling, which is what we've just touched on, going way over time, I'm sorry. Sustaining it, and the fidelity argument that we've spoken about. And maybe I should just stop